I'd like to tell a story today that I have adapted somewhat from the Zen tradition. This form of story is called a koan, which you might know is a somewhat perplexing parable that invites contemplation. So get ready to be perplexed. An old woman in China supported a monk and his two spiritual brothers for many years. She built them a hermitage and provided them with food and clothing. The lead monk served as the abbot of their small hermitage, providing guidance for this tiny community of brothers. After 20 years, the woman wondered what the monk and his brothers had attained, and she resolved to test them. She summoned a beautiful girl from the village and sent her to the abbot with instructions to embrace him and ask him how he feels. The girl caressed the monk and asked, "How do you feel just now?" "We all feel the same up here," quipped the monk. "A withered tree on a cold boulder has no warmth in winter." "How do you feel about others just now?" "A single flake of snow," said the monk, "touches only the person upon whom it falls." The girl returned to the old woman and told her what happened. "What?" the old woman said. "To think I have been supporting imposters all of these years." She grabbed a stick, hurried to the hermitage, and beat the abbot, shouting, "Get out of here!" The monk and his brothers fled in panic as she burned the hermitage to the ground. So ends the story. Now, we all understand what that meant, right? Koans are notoriously difficult to interpret. Practitioners and scholars of Zen articulate that it is precisely in the confusing actions, in the detachment of motivation from action, that the effect of the koan is achieved. In other words, by confusing the mind that is constantly grasping for understanding, the state of Zen, of meditative emptiness, is achieved. What's interesting to me is that when I read this koan, I had a different reaction. I actually thought that it made a lot of sense on a rational level, and I'm going to ask you to hear me out on this. So the woman had supported the hermitage because she thought that it would transform the monks. She thought that it would make them more enlightened. And in Mahayana Buddhism, of which Zen Buddhism is a part, that also means more compassionate, more caring towards others. But instead of doing that, it had left those monks unchanged, feeling like withered trees and lonely snowflakes. They had spent years in community with one another, and they had nothing to show for it. No wonder the woman grabbed a stick and ran up the hill. I would have at least wanted my money back. Now, whether and how community changes us is a core question for Unitarian Universalism. Unitarianism traces its understanding of community back to the Cambridge Platform, which was written in 1648, and it articulates how its congregations will function. The essence of the document said that members will care for one another, that they will seek to grow together spiritually, and that they will be present with one another through all of the occasions of life, through births and marriages and deaths. It said that they would walk together, realizing their full humanity by being together in community. When Unitarian Universalists use the word covenant, this is what we are talking about. It is this deep sense of promise that we will live together and care for one another through the joys and the difficulties of life, that we will be present for one another when it counts the most and even when it doesn't, that when we say, "I'm here," we mean it. We mean it. Now, my first sermon here at North Shore Unitarian Church, given not all that many moons ago, was about paradise. And one of the things that I said in that sermon is that I always viewed our congregations as small pieces of paradise. That our work together is to create paradise here on earth among each other. Now, I can imagine more than a few folks thinking during and perhaps after, "Wow, is that guy naive or something? Hasn't anyone told him about X, Y, or Z yet? At the very least, didn't he look at the minutes of the last finance meeting?" Now, I may not have known all of the specifics at the time. I knew some. But what I do know, and what I knew then, is that members of congregations can clash with each other. As our youth represented it so well in their drama this morning, and our people of all ages represented so well in our drama, people have disagreements. People get their feelings hurt, and they hurt other people's feelings too. We say things that are harmful, sometimes without intending those things, and sometimes out of spite. There is no secret to that, and I have certainly seen my fair share of it, and I've also made my fair share of mistakes. The question is, I think, are we willing to stick it out with each other? Are we willing to honor the promise, honor the covenant that we will come back together and try to repair relationships after they are broken? Because here's the thing. I believe that paradise is not some splendid utopia in which no one ever does anything wrong. That version of paradise is a dream. And I don't even know how desirable of a dream it is. It doesn't really sound like real people live there. What I think is more real, more honest, and even more appealing is a community that promises to be together in covenant, that articulates for itself the best way to be with one another, and that strives to reach for that goal even in the midst of difficulty and challenge. All the while, it knows that mistakes will be made. It knows that feelings will be hurt. It knows that disagreements will break out. Because that's what it means to be human together, to be in a real human community, honoring the promise that we have to one another, even in the midst of those challenges. All of this makes me think about Welch's grape jelly. Again, bear with me. Do any of you remember a contraption back in the 70s that was advertised on TV about how Welch's made its jelly? When the jelly was being cooked on the stove, the bubbles and steam would rise up to the top. And this contraption had on it was a pot, and it had on top of it this like kind of clear glass loop that sort of linked up for some, okay, I see a few people nod. So a few people know what I'm talking about here. This clear glass loop, and it would kind of like come up and do this curly-Q thing, and then it would go back down into the pot. So while the jelly was being cooked on the stove, the bubbles and steam would rise to the top, and then this clear tube would capture those bubbles and steam and circulate through the tube, kind of effervesce up through it, and then come reattach to the lid and circulate back down into the cooking pot. Now, Welch's made a big deal out of this because they said it captured the effervescence from the cooking process and returned the flavor to the jam so that it wouldn't be cooked off. I kind of think that that's bogus and that it was really just this advertising tactic, but who knows? All right, it worked on me, yeah, because I remembered it. And I still buy Welch's grape jelly. So Emil Durkheim, the father of modern sociology, said that communities are held together by a bubbling over of emotion, sort of like bubbles from that jelly contraption. And he called this social effervescence. In the social world, it is the effect of a group magnifying each other's emotions so that, which then causes the group to cohere. It causes the group to come together around a common feeling. You might think of a sports game, especially when fans experience their team winning, that sort of like effervescent, like overbearing joy that's shared among the group. Or you might think of a mob, which shares the same feeling of animosity. It doesn't all have to be positive. So whether that experience is joyful and uplifting or agitating and enraging, Durkheim says that the sort of bubbling over of emotion needs to happen in order to hold communities together. He places that at the core of community life. It's the core of his understanding of how groups of humans cohere. And it's a valuable insight. It is certainly true that groups throughout history have relied on collective experiences of emotion in order to cohere. But here's the thing. I am skeptical that Durkheim's thesis holds true in every case for every community, that every group is ultimately held together by that same kind of emotional outpouring. And this is because the relationship of covenant is not a relationship of shared effervescence. It is not the collective participation in an emotion of joy or agitation or whatever. Rather, it is a promise that precisely when we feel the least committed, the least engaged in community, the least feeling of common unity, that's when we will try to be present and come back into relationship with each other. Effervescence in the physical world, whether it's in grape jelly or a soda being opened, has an airy quality about it. And like the bubbles from those things, emotional effervescence easily disappears into the air. After we experience it, we go back to living the same lives that we lived before we felt it. It doesn't change us. But covenantal relationship, this deep walking together as a community, that does change us. It calls on us to be better people. It calls us to exercise forgiveness and compassion, patience and love. It calls on us to work to see the best in each other and to invite one another to live more fully into that. And in the process of becoming better people, living into the promises that we have made to one another, we begin to realize something of paradise in the here and now. So I'd like to close today with another story about a monastery. And don't worry, this one's not a Buddhist koan. All right, so this story of a monastery, it's about this small group of monks, also like the Buddhist koan, but this is a different story. This small group of monks had at once been a thriving monastery up in the hills in this unknown village, but it had fallen on hard times. And at this point, many of the members had gone away from it. Many of the members were getting older, and it only had a handful of these elderly monks left within it. And they didn't really like being with each other anymore. It was, they could barely stand each other. They could barely have dinner with one another. They were constantly annoyed with the other person, and they were really ready to call it quits. Well, the abbot of this monastery had dedicated his whole life to trying to sustain this group of monks. He was really despairing over this. He was devastated that at the end of his life, he had almost nothing to show for it. So it dawned on him one day that he remembered hearing of this very wise rabbi that lived a couple of towns over. And he thought, I'm going to go visit her and see if she has anything to say about this. What could it hurt? So he makes the journey, tells his brother he's setting out on a journey. He'll be back in a couple of days. And he goes and knocks on this rabbi's door. And she welcomes him in with open arms. And she consoles him and as he's sort of, struggling with this and says, yes. And she says, yes, the spiritual life is really hard. And this is all really hard stuff that we're doing. It really gives him some comfort. But that's not what he came for. That's not what he was looking for. He says, do you have any teaching that might help me in the middle of this? And she paused. And she paused. And she contemplated. And she said, well, there might be one thing. I'm not really sure. I can tell you what it is, but I don't really know if it's going to help you or if it's going to make any difference for you. But I can tell you this. The Messiah is among you. The Messiah is among your group. That abbot was shocked. He was like, I don't know what to do with that. So he's like wandering home, and as he's wandering home, he's thinking, Messiah is one of us. Well, who could it be? Could it be Peter? Peter's always clipping his nails at the dinner table. It can't be Peter. But but then again, Peter does kind of if like we get hurt, like he comes and he knows how to bandage a wound, and he's always there. But maybe it's Albert. Albert is really crotchety, but at the same time, Albert has a lot of spiritual insight. Maybe it's him. I don't know. So the monk goes back and he tells the other community of monks, this is what I found out. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if what information we have for it. What this is going to mean for us, but this is what she said. And then they went back to living their lives. But the thing is, each of them started to ask these questions. Could the Messiah be this particular person? This person that I have a disagreement with? This person that I have conflict with? This person that I'm struggling with? And what happened was, because they started to assume that any person within that community could possibly be the Messiah, they started to bring an extraordinary respect and reverence to the relationships that they had with one another. That feeling of reverence and respect began to emanate from that community. And on the rare occasions that they had visitors, the visitors were so compelled by it, they told other people about it. And before they knew it, more and more people were joining this monastery, coming because they were so compelled by this extraordinary feeling of respect and love and generosity and reverence that had been cultivated in those experiences. And it was all because they had discovered this truth, that the Messiah, the one who could usher in a paradise here on earth, was indeed one of them.